Our guest today is Professor Aadel Brun-Tschudi from the University of Oslo in Norway. You are well known in Scandinavia because of your many works on Asian countries, especially China and Japan. And I like to show some of the books you've been writing. For instance, Japan, Soluppgångens land, the land of the sunrise, from 1957. You also wrote an important part in the book Asia, whose editor was a Swedish professor, a large chapter on China and Japan. You've been participating in a Norwegian book for school use, and the last one, which came just a couple of months ago, describes your childhood in China partly, and also how it was to come back to China after many years together with your sisters and your brother. Your interest in the Asian countries is due to the fact that you spent your life as a young girl in China, where your parents were missionaries. And how was it then to come back to Norway after so many years in China?
It was a bad shock. At that time we settled down in a small town in southeastern part of Norway where the Norwegian Missionary Society had a property, and so we could stay there rather cheaply. And it was an industrial town and very much dominated by socialism and social democrats, and they were not particularly friendly towards mission. And at that time very few Norwegians knew much about mission work at all. The climate is entirely different now because Norwegians know more about developing countries, and it was a very, very bad shock. I can give as an example that we were, being missionaries, we were poor. It took some time before we got Norwegian equipment, and the very first day I went to the bookshop with the kind of umbrellas, the Chinese used paper and bamboo umbrellas, where the paper was oil, and it was I created quite a commotion both in the bookshop and in the streets. And my brother, he came home with the very first day. It was rather cold. We came from China, subtropical part of China, and my mother dressed us the way we used to go in China before she got Norwegian dresses, and he had long gowns like the Chinese had, and he came home with a gown torn, and the boys, the bigger boys, they had taken him apart in the schoolyard and stripped him naked to see whether he was a boy or a girl. So his experience was harder than the experiences of any other of us. I think that should be enough to show some of the climate that we encountered.
Did you speak very much about your Chinese experience then as a young girl or as a student in Oslo later on?
No, and I had many shocks. Among the very, very first lesson or a class in school, that was senior high school, I was asked by the teacher in Norwegian to read a passage from our book, it's a textbook, and I read a passage, and he said, listen to her, she can read Norwegian fluently, and she reads better than most of you. And of course I was so ashamed I wanted to hide. And these kind of experiences, they accumulated. So when I left the high school and entered university in Oslo, I met new people, you know, and I was very happy because then I could hide. No one knew my background. And for many years I never spoke of my background if I could help it.
Well, how do you think that the knowledge you have and you had of two different types of culture has had any influence on your work later on as a geographer?
I do think that the experience of having grown up in an entirely different culture which entered my bones, so to speak. I was educated by, taken care of by a Chinese ama, as well as by my mother, perhaps even more. She had even more influence on me than my mother, because my mother was a teacher, and she was working all the time as a teacher, teaching Chinese women to read and whatnot. And of course teaching them about the Christianity and the Bible and New Testament and so on and so forth. So the fact that this Chinese culture entered my bones has had an influence which is very hard to trace and to express, but it has made me more understanding of different cultures at all. So it makes, to me, it makes entirely sense, and that I, in my old age, has got the responsibility to build up development studies in geography at our university. So that's one of my responsibilities for the time being.
You just told us that you've been building up this special course in developing countries at the Department of Geography. Could you tell us something more about how you did this work and why you did it?
Well, I did it because there was a position, a professorate with special reference to developing countries, and I applied for it. I was sort of asked to apply for it, and even though Chinese was my main interest, and I had done more work in Far Eastern as a Far Eastern specialist, both I was then in the Department of or the Institute of East Asian Studies, our university, both in that capacity and previously in the capacity of foreign news analyst with the Far East as my specialty in Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. I had mainly worked on China and the Far East, but even so, I was sufficiently interested in the problems of developing countries generally in order to apply for this professorship, and I got it, and so this has been my responsibility for a number of years, but it has been a kind of hard uphill job, I must say. But I've had some very nice young research fellows and assistants, and we've had a very good team working together, and the students have been very responsive and interesting, so I've had a grand time working with these students and research fellows.
This has led you to visit various other countries outside the Asian part of the world. Do you think that the young students who are coming back from developing countries as geographers or sociologists or something else could bring back knowledge useful for Norwegian or Scandinavian planners and for the Scandinavian society in general?
I do think it should be possible, and it's one of the aims that I've been working towards, but I don't think it's feasible or practical for a number of years yet, because I don't think that there's a sufficient response, sufficient understanding to make this kind of exchange possible. But we have experimented in our department last autumn because I had a sabbatical, and a professor in geography from Sri Lanka with whom my research fellows, my companions, with whom they had cooperated in Sri Lanka. He came as a regular substitute and entered and took part in our regular work as a lecturer and took over my responsibilities. And it was quite a success, but he was exceptionally good. He spoke clear, fine English, and the students were very responsive. And as proof of his success, I can say that he ended off with as big an audience as when he started, and that's rare.
You have spent many years working in the very house where we are now making this recording, the house of the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, and I think it's a very happy and fortunate coincidence that we can sit here together and chat today. Could you tell us a little bit more about your work in the 1950s as a special correspondent with the Asian problems here in Oslo?
I've had a career which is not so usual anymore among women, because now it's more usual for women in the academic field to continue their studies and research work and teaching and whatnot continuously. But I had a break. When I married and got children, I spent time mostly in my house with the household chores and with the children and so on and so forth. And on top of this, my husband was a clergyman. So I thought that sooner or later I will have to enter into the responsibilities of a minister's wife. But it so happened that he mainly worked with a church paper, and that was not necessary. So when I just happened to be asked to try a program here in this house, I was more than 40 years, and then I started, and it went all right, but I felt that I needed some formal training. And then I eventually took my degree, and my boys were big enough to come and listen to the orals. The orals were then and are then public. And so I got a kind of formal appointment, not regularly working every day in this house, but in a team of foreign news analysts. I had Far East as my special field, but also sometimes when it was necessary or important, I also analyzed news from African countries and so on and so forth. All it more or less depended on circumstances, what was needed. And is that what you want, or do you want me to?
No. Then how did you then become a geographer, switching from Norwegian broadcasting to?
That was I felt the need for a formal training, and I had started studying geography but never finished my degree because I married. And as I said, then there was a time when there was much unemployment among theological candidates, and my husband ended up as an assistant teacher in a small, well, what would you call the secondary school in the northern part of Norway. It was not so easy. But I was all the time interested in geography, and I started some research on the settlement geography in that part of the country. A very remote valley which was populated from southeastern part of Norway in the end of the 17th and beginning of 18th century, because then the Norwegian farmers were very poor, and there was a lot of immigration from southeastern part of Norway up to the very northernmost part of the country. And so I was all the time interested in geography, but as I said, my career was discontinuous because of circumstances, marriage and so on and so forth, and I didn't finish until after I had started working as a foreign news analyst here in this house. And then it was quite natural for me to take geography as my subject for my final degree, and also quite natural to concentrate on the Far East. And it so happened that in this house, the man who had that job before me, he died, so I could just enter a vacancy, so to speak.
Yes. I understand that in this book, Asia, there is a chapter which you are especially fond of. You said to me that you think this is one of the best things you've been doing. Could you explain why you like this work of yours and so?
I have been especially interested in the Chinese agriculture and how it's organized, and the huge work, and also the inputs in agriculture in China after 1949, after what the Chinese say call their liberation in 1949. And I do agree, it was a liberation, not only a revolution, it was more than that. And so that's my longest chapter on what they have succeeded in doing within the field of agricultural production and productivity, and also in the people's communes organizing agriculture, so that this progress was possible. I do think it's much due to the very admirable way that they have organized the peasants in people's communes for collective work, in able to improve the infrastructure in agriculture and improve the capacity, the capability of Chinese agriculture. And so that's the chapter I am, I think, where I've been most successful.
Did you draw your the knowledge you had from your childhood in China? Did you use it to produce this?
Partly from my childhood, because my father was very much interested in the farming system and in agriculture, and he was a trained gardener before he studied theology, and also had a small firm for a couple of years in between his ending of his high school and before he entered university. So he had some background for really understanding the plight of the Chinese peasants at that time and why agriculture was so intensive, and also what the landlords and the landlord system did to all the peasants by way of, I would say, enslaving them. I was the oldest of 7 sisters and 1 brother, and so I was sometimes allowed to walk with my father. He never let the Chinese carry him in sedan chairs, as was the usual at that time. My mother was so weak after all her childbirth, and she also had some sickness, so she always was carried by 4 in a sedan chair with 4 carriers, and I was old enough to be able to walk with my father, and he explained to me, look at this and that, and that's why they do it and how they do it and so on and so forth. So my interest in agriculture was initiated by my father, and then I have also been interested in agricultural questions and rural settlement in Norway as a geographer. So I have done some research on rural questions and settlement in Norway as well as in China, and the two tie in together. And of course, it's very natural to occupy oneself mainly with Chinese agriculture in a land in a country like China, where 80% or more of the population is living in the countryside and working in farming in one capacity or the other.
Well, this was about this book. Is there any other book that you would like to talk about? Any other work of yours that you are very fond of, which you think is which you consider to be a success? It doesn't have to be a public success. It's something you feel is valid.
Yes, I've done something on Norwegian rural settlement, which I like very much, and also on tomato growing in southwestern part of Norway. And I just happened to travel through one of the fjords in southwestern part of Norway with my husband, and then I happened to see how many glass houses, hot houses there were, and I wondered, it was a strange agrarian landscape. With my interest in agriculture and rural settlement ties also in an interest in the human-made landscapes. And this was a very strange landscape, and so I went back, and for a number of years I did research, and that's a major, what would you call it, article paper on tomato growing on these islands, and why they have settled on tomato growing, and the size of the business, and so on and so forth.
I would also like to ask you, Aadel, if you could tell us something of the persons, that could be teachers or colleagues or relatives or any other, who have inspired you in your work, who given you the ideas in your research, and could you also explain why they were so important?
And I must start off with my dear husband, because I was studying, I had taken exams in history and English language, and was studying the Norwegian language, and I was engaged at that time, and my fiancée said, I don't understand why you are working with Norwegian language, which is so boring to you. Why don't you study geography? And so I switched over to geography and found that extremely absorbing and interesting, and I was fortunate to have as my teacher then, and now Professor Emeritus in our university. His name is Fridtjof Isaksen, and he is well known in international, among geographers internationally, particularly perhaps in France and in Sweden, but also in other countries. And he encouraged me very much, and it was partly due to his encouragement or his suggestion that I took up geography after I had started as a foreign news analyst in this house. That was in 1951. He came to my home and said, Aadel, you have written articles on political subjects on East Asia, but I like more what you have written on geography. Why don't you finish your degree? And so it was a kind of a challenge from the outside, which corresponded to an urge, inner urge. I don't know whether I would have the courage or the insistence or to take it up if it hadn't been for these encouragements from other people.
From your husband.
And I would also like to mention the fact that the then head of the Foreign News Department, Toralf Øksnevad, who meant very much to all Norwegians, I should say, during the Second World War, because he was head of the, he ran that department of the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation, which was located in Great Britain, and they sent programs to Norway. He was also very encouraging right from the beginning.
I've noticed that you are the only woman at the Department of Human Geography in Oslo. How is it to be a woman among so many men?
I must admit that it has been like my work to develop the geography of developing countries. It has been an uphill job, rather uphill. But I don't think there is any reason why you should expand on that subject. I think I have my experience corresponds very much to the experience of other women in my age who have not had the possibilities and the encouragement that young women have nowadays. I do think I'm still the only woman geographer in a senior position. I know there is an assistant in one of the other departments in Norway, but I don't think there are any permanently applied academic geographer who is a woman so far.
I thank you very much for this little chat, and I also like to thank the Norwegian radio for giving us the opportunity of talking together. Thank you.